Hi, friends. Welcome back to our series on Christian Zionism. This is episode number 5 of the series we've been having discussing the history and the theology and also the political action and activism of Christian Zionism. So make sure, if you haven't done so yet, to check out the previous episodes. Here in this episode, I am joined by Pastor Don Wagner to discuss the challenge of Christian Zionism and how to respond to it. Don Wagner is a retired pastor, and until recently, he was the national program director for Friends of Sabeel North America, or what is known as FOSNA. He was also a professor of Middle East Studies and the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at North Park University in Chicago. He has written many books on Palestinian human rights, on Christians in the Middle East, and also Christian Zionism, and most recently his memoirs in 2022 titled Glory to God in the Lowest, Journeys to an Unholy Land. Don has a lot of experience dealing with Christian Zionism, and in our conversation, he shares about his background and his journey out of Christian Zionism, and explains to us two kinds of Zionisms that he has encountered, one more fundamentalist conservative one, and also a more liberal progressive Christian Zionism. So that is interesting. And then he helps us to discuss theological and biblical critiques to Christian Zionism, mostly through what he calls settler colonial analysis, and the other one through liberation theology. For our Patreon supporters, he also here puts on his pastoral hat, and he gives advice to many Christians. I know many of them who listen to this podcast who have been feeling isolated in their own church communities, as they have been thinking about Palestine and Israel, as they have been thinking about the war in Gaza. And he, in a very helpful and a pastoral way, gives a very encouraging advice to these Christians who want to continue doing the work, advocating for peace and for justice in Palestine and Israel. So check that out if you support us on Patreon. If you do not, maybe this is a good chance for you to do so. The link to our Patreon link is in the description. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Don Wagner. Hi, Don Wagner. I'm so glad that you are here with me in this conversation on Christian Zionism. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while now, so this is fantastic. Thanks for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been doing a lot of work. You've been involved in this issue and the Palestine-Israel issue. You've written a book about your journey and your experience. Can you just, for the audience sake, tell us a bit about yourself and kind of your journey from kind of growing up in that kind of conservative family and kind of discovering Christian Zionism, and then kind of your journey out of that?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. Yeah, I grew up in Buffalo, New York area, for a very conservative family. My dad was a World War II veteran, and he was very active in the Republican Party. Mainly my mom and my grandparents, who I lived with while my dad was in World War II, were very committed to Christian Zionism. Every evening, my grandparents would sit down and read their Schofield Bible, and you know what that is. It's all got the outline of the dispensational theology. So that's what I grew up believing. And I remember going to a revival. They said, "We're not doing the Bible study tonight. We're going to a revival." And this was a little country church between Niagara Falls and Buffalo. And the preacher was a former wrestler. So he's about 6'5", 300 pounds, and preaching on hell in the final days. And he scared the hell out of me because it was like, we're about to, we know we're in the end times because now Israel has been established and it's the countdown to the rapture, the Battle of Armageddon, and all of that. And if you don't believe in Jesus, you could be left behind to face all the conflagration. So I was a little 8-year-old, and I didn't go forward, but I made a little prayerful commitment in my heart. And so that was kind of the part of my formation. And I got, I had some problems with that theology when I was about 12 or 13. I just didn't see how this militant warrior Jesus fit with what I was reading in the Bible. So I kind of pulled out of that. My mother never did. To her dying day, she said, Don, why do you bother with the Palestinian issue? This is not going to be solved till Jesus returns. And so she always held on to that. My dad didn't have that. So then I go off later to seminary at Princeton, and I got another dose of Christian Zionism, the post-Holocaust mainline liberal. Reading Reinhold Niebuhr and following his political work, but also Van Buren and other theologians. So I embrace the post-Holocaust theology, never again for Israel and the Jewish people. And eventually that was challenged in my second pastorate in Evanston when I first heard a real academic and personal story by a professor named Ibrahim Abalugod of the Nakba, of his family being driven out. And it jarred my narrative. I didn't buy it at first, but eventually I began to meet with him, and he advised I need to go to the Middle East and see it for myself. And that changed me completely. And within about 2 years of that, of going to Beirut and then down to Palestine, I left the pastorate and began work full-time on Palestine.
Yeah, just for the audience, Ibrahim Abalugod was a Palestinian American intellectual. I think he passed away a while ago.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
He was one of the foremost kind of Palestinian intellectuals of
absolutely.
his time.
He, Edward Said, and a few others. And he was a member of the PLO National Council, and he eventually moved back and taught at Birzeit in his last days.
Could you do tell the story about bringing him to your church and some kind of pushback you got? Can you just tell that story here again?
Yeah, that was it. So he was the one I heard. I was very much a liberal Zionist at that point, and it was my first month at the church, and I was in charge of adult education, church and society issues. So we had a committee, and one of the committee members said, let's do a course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I said, sure. And he made me a little nervous because he was very pro-Palestinian. He was a fundraiser at Northwestern University, and he said, the church should, for a change, look at this differently about the party that's been victimized, the Palestinians. So right away I said, look, if we do anything, it needs to be balanced. So I believed in the myth of parity and balance at that point. So so the committee said, okay, Don, you bring in the Israeli speakers, since that's your orientation, and we'll let Bill and a couple others bring in the Palestinians. So I brought the Israeli Consul General in. He gave a passionate defense. And this was 1974, January, right after, shortly after the 73 war. So he said, Israel has been under attack by the Arab forces, and we need you, the church, and Americans to stand by little Israel against all these forces. So I bought into that, and so I was real pleased with the Consul General that day. Next week, Bill brings in this professor who was chair of the political science department at nearby Northwestern University. We were just a few blocks from the university in Evanston, Illinois. And Abalugod gave this personal story and then brilliant analysis, and it just jarred my whole narrative. And I didn't buy it completely, but boy, I sure paid attention. And the next morning, Monday morning, I walked into my office, and my first phone call was from two Holocaust survivors in nearby Skokie who said, if this course is not stopped, we are going to picket your church and go to the papers about you have embraced a PLO terrorist in your church. Abba Lugod is a member of the PLO National Council. So I went down and told the senior pastor, and he said, geez, you've been here 3 weeks and we've already got major problems. He was joking. So we had a backup plan in case we're picketed and all that. And they were just blowing smoke. Nothing happened. So that was I came from a black church initially, my first pastorate, where we could talk about anything. We had the Black Panthers in the sanctuary. Anything went. So I thought, yeah, we can do this here. But no, this issue was different. So it prepared me for a future of pushback.
It's incredible to me that the kind of these issues that you just brought up, like the whole thing with the both sides, how things in balance, still continues today. The whole demonization of the Palestinian voice and threatening. Like this is, I don't know if this is not public per se, but I don't know if you know about the Lausanne movement. They have their conference right now in Seoul in South Korea. And there's been some pushback right now because one theologian mentioned Palestine and justice for the Palestinians. And then you had people on the other side threatening, and Lausanne had to issue a statement to apologize. So like this continues to be like a thing that is happening today. It's remarkable.
I just got back from Washington, D.C., where we were doing some lobbying and all that, and walking through the halls of Congress lobbying on Monday and Tuesday. It seemed like half the offices had a sign on their door, "We stand with Israel." And the lobby is powerful. And it's not just the pro-Israel Jewish lobby. It's the Christian Zionists, Kufi and the rest, who are putting pressure.
Hi, everyone. I want to invite you to join me in person this December in California. Our friends at the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East are hosting their annual forum, and I'm going to be there. I'm actually giving a keynote talk on Saturday night. I'm also excited to announce that we're planning to record a live episode of a panel discussion for Across the Divide at the forum itself. It's going to be a great weekend to meet fellow peacemakers and have fellowship and learn from each other. You'll get to connect with Christians from around North America who are looking for thoughtful conversations about Palestine and Israel, and listen to Christian leaders advocating for human rights and for peace and justice, and also figure out ways to support each other and work together for truth, justice, and the flourishing of both Palestinians and Israelis. There's a virtual option to join the forum online, but it's kinda lame. Come in person if you can. I would love to meet you. The forum will be in Santa Barbara, California on Friday, December 6th through Sunday the 8th. Learn more and register at nemi.network/forum. That is NEME.network/forum. This year, we need each other more than ever. I hope to see you there. Okay, so before we talk about kind of the lobbying power of Christian Zionism and maybe how Christians can respond and what we should be doing, just kind of let's unpack the two Zionism you mentioned. You grew up with a dispensational fundamentalist Zionism, which you try to distinguish from evangelicalism. So this is a branch of fundamentalist Christianity, could be evangelical as well.
Yes.
That is dispensational and so on. And there's a liberal Zionism, and you quoted Niebuhr for us. There's also an element of Catholic Zionism.
Yes.
And both of those came out as a response to the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and so on. So putting aside dispensationalism, I think the audience by now is fairly familiar with it and how problematic and really bad of a theology and even anti-Semitic that theology is in many ways. So let's kind of try to unpack this idea of liberal Zionism, because for the most part, people associate Christian Zionism with fundamentalist Christians and evangelicals. So what is liberal Zionism and how does it work out exactly?
Yeah, I think it's, although it was around before World War II, It's pretty much a response to the creation of Israel and the Holocaust. And Reinhold Niebuhr is one, I'll mention primarily, this very liberal progressive theologian, but he was very much oriented towards Zionism. He founded a lobby. There was a Protestant lobby. They put a lot of pressure on Truman to support the creation of a Jewish state as opposed to one democratic state. And in November 1947, that's exactly what happened, that the U.S. lobbied other nations in the UN along with England, and the partition was passed to create a Jewish state. And Niebuhr also was part of a journal called Christian Century, which was taken a more Palestinian stance in those years. Today, it's not. It's reversed. So he broke from that and founded a journal called Christianity in Crisis, which was very liberal, Union Theological Seminary, very left, progressive on everything, but not on Palestine. So we call that PEP, Progressive Except Palestine. Right. And Mark Ellis talks about that as, the ecumenical deal, that we must stand with Israel. We support Israel. And pastors, theologians, seminaries, Bible colleges are taught, let's have dialogue with the Jewish community, but don't bring up Palestine. It's complicated. Let us as the Jewish community take care of that, and we'll advise you. So this is pretty much it. And these views really pretty much have been dominant in the mainline churches until maybe late 70s, 80s, where they began to be challenged. And it's still very much an issue today. Now, the Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, and several others have been very progressive in recent years. I'm Presbyterian. It took us 10 years at our annual conventions before we passed a BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions resolution. And it narrowly passed. I remember lining up. We would have the American Jewish Committee, Simon Wiesenthal, the Jewish Federation on one side saying, you Presbyterians should not adopt BDS. It's anti-Semitic. It threatens the future security of Israel. On the other side, we would be standing with Jewish Voice for Peace, Muslim community, and Palestinians calling for BDS as a legitimate nonviolent response to the oppression. So that's how it works. And it's still an ongoing struggle. The Episcopal Church and some others are having far more difficulty.
I know that the Methodist Church, I think recently.
Oh, the Methodist Church has been very strong.
But I think the Episcopalian Church tried to pass something recently, but I think it failed.
It failed. Yeah.
I wanna go back to kind of liberal Zionism and so on, but just because you mentioned BDS, so BDS is a national movement, a global movement, but kind of started in Palestine by the civil society in Palestine. BDS, yes, standing for Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions, which is, like you just said, a nonviolent, I would also say creative, beautiful way to resist in a nonviolent way through boycotting certain products, divesting from certain companies, and putting sanctions in Israel. And that's it's seen by many, especially in Palestine and those who support the Palestinians, as a legitimate way to put pressure on Israel to end the occupation. Is that kind of fair summary?
Yeah, that's very, very fair. And, I remember giving speeches and saying in churches when we were trying to get churches behind this, saying, look, for me, it's a matter of Christian stewardship. I believe that my finances, my activities, everything should be subject to the values of Jesus, and even my taxes. if there are certain things that I'm buying, be it Amazon or stuff like that, if they're involved in the settlements, we need to honor the values and say that's illegal, and I'm not going to buy that. And that we may need a campaign, such as that little soda stream machine. That was the one thing we boycotted. Caterpillar, which destroys many of the homes and builds the settlements. They're supporting injustice according to international law, which is our guide. And it also, I look at my values as a Christian, Matthew 25, that we need to be with those who are suffering and are victims of the oppression. So that's kind of the theological background, and that's, part of the rationale.
I love that you can do that easily, right? That you can say, "Hey, this is a political action. This is something economic. I don't want to support Caterpillar because it's profits from the suffering of the Palestinians." But in the same breath, you can say, "This is actually coming out of my faith." Yes. Matthew 25, yes. Christ identifying with the hungry, with the thirsty, with the naked, and I'm going to identify with them. Right. That's really beautiful, and I think. Yeah, I think many Christians need to do a lot of work to get to that place where you are. Obviously, you've been doing this for a long time.
It took a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially since you came up from a very fundamentalist background, to reach that place. I would love to talk with you eventually for our Patreon supporters about any kind of tips and advice you can give Christians who are right now coming out of that place and are being activated. But just so that we don't lose the flow of the conversation. So you mentioned Mark Ellis, also just to give some background. He's the late Jewish theologian. He just passed away a few months ago in 2024. Wonderful person. Wrote a seminal work on Jewish liberation theology, which he defines in relation to the Palestinian story. And the ecumenical deal you mentioned is coming out of this repentance towards anti-Semitism, but then because of this act of pietistic repentance, says it kind of led eventually to this. We don't want to talk about the Palestinians because if we do, we would have to be critical, and we cannot be critical anymore because of what we have been doing to the Jews prior to now. So that becomes this deal, this ecumenical deal of Jewish-Christian dialogue.
And I think we need to acknowledge the history of anti-Semitism, which is very real in Christian history. So we've got that. But we can't be silenced or allow that to become a weapon that eliminates our commitment and our concern for another injustice to the Palestinians.
Right. So it's like both and, right? Like you're saying, you can do both at the same time. I would love to hear more. I don't want to talk too much here, but it's because you oppose anti-Semitism, you oppose the oppression of the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, how do you kind of frame this kind of critique of liberal Zionism or this kind of ecumenical deal?
Well, I think it's again, we have to. I stand with Jewish Voice for Peace. We work with American Muslims for Palestine. Just the basic principle: until the Palestinians are free, Jews and Israel will never be free. They will always be locked into, kind of a war platform. And Zionism was really a settler colonial ideology, and its fundamental goals are the erasure and removal of the indigenous population. And if this is ongoing, there's always going to be resistance and opposition. So Jews in Palestine will never be free, and Jews worldwide have a responsibility to embrace that injustice. So we have to approach this intersectionally. We got to work with the Jewish progressives, and thank God young Jews are not buying Zionism anymore. So we didn't have that when I first got involved in this issue. We just had a few Jewish leaders like Mark Ellis and a few others. Now we got a whole cadre, and they're teaching us things. American Muslims for Palestine are amazing. They were lobbying in bigger numbers than we were as a Christian group on Monday, Tuesday in the halls of Congress, with better training than we have. But, here now we have an opportunity to work together with the Black community and many others, and to liberate Israel. And the days of genocide that we're in now makes it extremely difficult. And with the Biden administration locked into a Zionist footing and talking about ceasefire out of one side of their mouth and then supplying weapons the next day, this is our challenge. And so we got a long, long journey ahead of us.
And Biden is as a Catholic, and he would be a liberal, so he would be a liberal Zionist.
Absolutely.
I don't think his Zionism is informed by his Catholicism per se, but it's a liberal Zionist kind of ideology.
Yeah. Right? But he would represent that, and I think there are others in the Senate that would be. Maybe their theology will inform it, but I think it's really a political issue. Biden talks about how he, and I've seen reports of this, even recordings, how as a young senator, he went before AIPAC and said, I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. I receive money from AIPAC, and I proudly give money to AIPAC. And he has continued this. And look at the embrace of Netanyahu, this uncritical, disturbing embrace of really a genocidal footing. So that's how it plays out. But I don't think he is informed theologically.
Okay. So that, I think, takes me to another thing I would like to discuss with you, which is the place of theological critique in responding to Christian Zionism. We had Gary Burge on the series, and he discussed the land and the people. Also, Stephen Sizer talked about the history of dispensationalism and also gave a theological response and how they misuse the text. Do you think that the biblical/theological critique is sufficient to respond to Christian Zionism, or is it a different kind of tactic we should be focusing on, you think?
Great question. Thank you for that. When I began to do research on Zionism, and it was autobiographical, having grown up in it, I did my doctoral dissertation on it, wrote it in the late 70s, early 80s. And my approach was really that a biblical critique and theological critique is the best way to change and address Christian Zionism. I don't believe that anymore. It's still important, but I'd put it secondary or even in third place. My analysis now informs me, and I've been doing this a change in my approach probably for 5-6 years now, that Zionism and Christian Zionism are political issues. It's a political ideology that has weaponized the Bible. And we've got to get at that core problem before we address the Bible. I learned from a wonderful Catholic liberation theologian, Michael Pryor. He's the one that turned me on to settler colonial analysis. So I began to study and get into that a lot more. And I think Zionism is a settler colonial ideology, which means it's an ideology that will not just be a colonial occupation, but its goal is to replace the indigenous people. Christian Zionism came along and precedes, in terms of its historical development, Christian Zionism preceded the official founding of Zionism in 1897 with Herzl. But you could even see a political dimension of Christian Zionism supporting the political goals. Someone like William E. Blackstone in Chicago, he organized the first political lobby for Zionism in 1891 and 1892. And it was calling for a Jewish state in Palestine, lobbying the president, mobilizing even the Supreme Court justice, senators, congressmen. So 1891, this evangelical fundamentalist Christian Zionist was organized. And there was another before him, William E. Heckler, who was a chaplain to the British forces in Vienna. He supported Herzl, worked with him, introduced him to the German Kaiser to support a land in Palestine backed by the Germans. They went on to the Ottoman. He introduced them to the Ottoman Caliph and so on. So there is that history. And I start my analysis of Christian Zionism with Heckler, and even to go back to Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury, who was a political operative and a lobbyist. He's the one, we're not sure, there are two reports on this, but I'll credit Shaftesbury for now. He's the one that first said, a land of no people for a people of no land. And if you look at that, that is a settler colonial theology. A people with no land? Yeah, maybe. But a land of no people? Palestine was fully occupied. Even when Herzl established the World Zionist Congress, Palestine was 94% Arab, Christian, and Muslim, 5% or 4% Jewish, and then maybe 1% internationals. So look at the population ratio. So Zionism had the goal of slowly but steadily erasing the indigenous population. So that is the program. That is settler colonialism. And I've done a lot of reading of settler colonial theology is now a legitimate academic program within anthropology. And I think this is where we need to turn. So Michael Pryor introduced me to that. And they have this this term, terra nullius, which is Latin for a land, empty land, a land of nobody. So this is what Zionism saw, a land of nobody, a people of no land. And this is the kind of a simple definition of the settler colonial approach. But I couple it with liberation theology.
Okay. Yeah.
As the theological platform, the call to the poor, the call to solidarity, the preferential option of the poor. And I've learned this over time, and I think this fits whether we're evangelical, Catholic, mainline, that there's something to be said. And I see now our Palestinian sisters and brothers like Mitri Raheb, Munther Isaac, Naim Atik, and Omar Harami, many others, using this kind of a call to the poor, but their own indigenous Palestinian theology.
Friends, if you're enjoying this episode and want to support Across the Divide, consider supporting the work we're doing here through our Patreon page at patreon.com/acrossthedivide. By becoming a monthly supporter, you'll gain access to unpublished content and other exclusive benefits. Again, the link is patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Thank you, and back to the episode.
So liberation theologies, specifically Catholic theology, came out of Latin America.
Yeah.
But yeah, the way you're using it now, because the people you mentioned, none of them is Catholic.
Right.
But you're using the principles of this identification with the poor and the oppressed to make theological reflections and analysis on their reality. So I think there's a pushback that I'm going to give you now, which because I'm thinking also of our audience who have not really read on settler colonialism, probably would come from more Protestant evangelical spaces. So liberation theology is not something they have listened to or read, or examined. So both of these tend to be more for many people are like foreign concepts.
Yeah.
So like how do you what can they do if they are not part of those traditions? Maybe they should be, but yeah. Right. So because for a lot of them, it's all about the Bible, what the Bible says, and I need to follow the Bible. The Bible says this, therefore this. Yeah. So how can you kind of help them kind of work through that in a way that could be also meaningful to them and productive?
Coming from that background, I understand. Because when I first went to seminary and got my first course in liberation theology, I was still very much an evangelical and had a lot of that biblical orientation. And the professor his name was Professor Richard Schall. He came out of liberation and called himself a Marxist Christian theologian, which kind of put me off. Oh my God!
Right? Yeah, it's a huge problem if in the West, right?
It just scrambled. It shook up my theology, all my core beliefs. So I went almost through a depression while he's challenging everything I believed biblically. So I guess how do we, as evangelicals, wrestle with these issues? I think the first thing I'd recommend for viewers is to begin to read and listen to our Palestinian sisters and brothers. People like Munther Isaac and Mitri Raheb, even Naim Atik, and people like you, young evangelicals, and there's many who are reflecting on this genocide, this crisis you are in, where your future is at risk. And how do you make sense of this? And I see Mitri Raheb using terms, or Munther. We just had Munther Isaac here, this amazing Palestinian Lutheran and an evangelical, by the way. He's the one who preached on Christmas Eve, where is God in all of this? And God is in the rubble. And then he had Jesus in the rubble in their creche, little baby Jesus in the rubble. This is where God is. So this is the beginning that we turn to the oppression and we begin to critique it theologically from that point of view. God is with the suffering. And if we look at it biblically, this is why I titled my memoir, Glory to God in the Lowest. It's kind of counterintuitive. We think of glory to God in the highest at the annunciation of Jesus' birth. But Jesus' whole life, just follow Jesus. Jesus is central, be it evangelical, whatever. Just follow Jesus, who goes to the margins, to the poor, the tax collectors, the brokenhearted. And it's Matthew 25, it's the Beatitudes, it's all over. So read the Bible now through these eyes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, you think it's like so intuitive and like simple, like just read Matthew 5-7. It shouldn't be that hard, It's like, how do you take Jesus seriously? And especially if people are conservative and evangelical, you always say we take Jesus seriously, we take the Bible literally. Okay, do it. Do it.
Look at the Kairos. Yeah, read the Kairos document, which is a beautiful expression from Palestinian Christians of all denominations. And it's really a call to love the neighbor, but to love justice and apply Jesus' values to the present situation. I think I've become, after going through a very liberal and liberation, radical phase, I've just become more and more Jesus-centered in my whole approach, Jesus values.
Right. Yeah. And the irony is that conservatives would say, "Oh, if you become liberal, then you have rejected Jesus," and we're saying, "No, I went back to Jesus." Yeah. That's awesome. By the way, we have actually Munther's sermon on the podcast. I think it's episode 3 or 4, right in the beginning. So people, if you want to listen to that sermon, please do. I'll make sure to also include the link of the Kairos Palestine document for people who are interested in reading that. But yeah, thank you for centering the Palestinian Christian voice. I think, and actually, this is kind of a question that I've been wrestling with. Which is why are Palestinians invisible, right? And we talked about this
Yeah.
liberal Zionism, and we need to support Israel, a land without a people, for a people without a land. So the land is invisible. Like, why is it so hard for so many well-meaning, I think I would assume they're decent, like, people? Why is it so hard for them to see the Palestinian? And I get maybe 150 years ago with Shaftesbury or Darby and those folks, they just don't,
Yeah.
Palestinians and Arabs are insignificant. But that still persists to today in the
Yeah.
political discourse, in Christian Zionism, in so many churches. From your just experience with all of this, why are we so invisible as Palestinians?
Oh, I think it's multifaceted. I mean, Palestinians are invisible to Joe Biden and Blinken. I mean, look at Blinken just lied before Congress that, where the issue of why is humanitarian aid not getting into the Palestinians.
Right.
He defended Israel and lied about it.
Just for context here, there's a law in the U.S. that you would basically, I don't know what the rule is, but basically, if there's any kind of limitation or restrictions on humanitarian aid from the U.S.,
Right.
you would not support that country. That happened. Israel did not allow humanitarian access to Gaza, but he lied and kept the weapon export to Israel.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're referring to,
That's right. It's actually illegal. It's illegal according to U.S. law to fund a country that is preventing humanitarian aid, let alone medicine, food, where Israel is intentionally using a strategy of starvation and disease along with the bombardment to erase Palestinians. So it's illegal, according to U.S. law, for this to be allowed and to weaponize the whole issue. Well, I think it's a very complicated question, Easley. It's not simple. The media is, I think, one of the big culprits, our government, so that Palestinians are invisible in the news. And this is part of the Zionist lobby's goal. Do not humanize the Palestinian. And if you look at even the military, the Israeli Defense Forces, the head of the Defense Forces, as soon as October 7th happened, the attack on Israel, and I condemn what Hamas did in terms of kidnapping people, taking hostages, and killing people. But they had a right to resist at the same time under international law. But immediately, the head of the IDF said, we are going to deny the Palestinians food, water, and we're going to bomb them because they are human animals. They are subhuman. I'm right from the top. And then Netanyahu, a few weeks later, uses the whole Amalek biblical thing, which is a biblical, I think it might be mythological. There may have been an Amalek who did attack the Jews when they came out of the wilderness. That seems to be the root of this. But he used a biblical theme where Amalek is the enemy, the Arab today. So annihilate Amalek. And the extremist militant Jewish Israeli settlers and the Christian Zionists knew exactly what he said. Most of the people said, what the hell is that? We don't know what that Amalek is. But the Christian Zionists and the militant religious Kahana followers knew exactly what he meant. Annihilate, completely erase. Genocide then is permissible theologically. So all this, I think, goes into why we don't, we've taken sides as a government with Israel. So when hostages are taken, we know their names. Palestinians, every day, how many are killed? Not a name, no humanity. So it's permissible. And then they're demonized as animals. So this is part of our challenge. I think this is why we as Christians, evangelicals, whoever we are, Catholic, need to center Palestinian voices like you and humanize. This is one of our challenges. And isn't that central to what Jesus was doing? My God, where he would lift up a child, or he would spend time with the tax collector, or go to a widow's home and heal the child. He was focused on lifting up the oppressed and humanizing them and healing them and centering them in his world. So I think this is very much what we're called to, reverse this dehumanization of the Palestinians and challenge our media, challenge our churches.
Yeah, I remember when Mike Pence, the previous vice president, conservative, evangelical, Bible following, all of that, who I think when he was in office, he went to the Knesset and spoke there.
Yes.
And he said, we support Israel because we support democracy, we support freedom. And he said, this is a battle between light and darkness, goodness and evil.
Yeah.
Right. So if you use that binary, of course, you're the good guy. Of course you are. Then by definition, anyone who opposes you is evil, is darkness.
Yeah.
And that's how you can easily just paint everyone with this white brush, and everyone is bad, everyone is evil if they come.
That's a perfect example. And Christian Zionism is largely this kind of a binary dualism, and good versus evil, and we can't allow that simplistic theological or biblical analysis. And Jesus is the one who scrambles that completely and personalizes it and calls us, away from that dualistic good versus evil.
This is Georgia from Colorado. I just want to say thank you so much for the Across the Divide podcast. I've learned so much. Daniel, I really appreciate your challenge that we should not centralize Western analysis of theology as the only analysis, and that Gaza really represents a theological crisis for the West. And just the profound impact that bad theology has on Palestinian lives. And I find it heartbreaking and tragic, and I appreciate your voice speaking into that and hosting the conversation. Thank you.
Because we're coming to the end of our conversation, let's kind of transition to responses, what Christians ought to be doing right now. I kind of appreciate some of the stuff you're saying there, especially how you respond to Christian Zionism as heresy. I would love to hear that from you, how you work that out. But what should be done, you think, by Christians into response to challenge Christian Zionism today?
Well, I think to go back to follow Jesus, to reiterate that, let's just start there and go deep into it. And then listen to these Palestinian voices, these theologians who are writing about this. Then bring them. We need to bring them and circulate them in our churches. But even more important, if we can, go to Palestine. My life was changed when I went to Beirut in 1977 for the first time, saw the refugee camps, and was taken in by these poor refugees who had nothing, and I was given dinner while the kids were in the back and had some meager meal. So the Palestinian hospitality and the beautiful humanity, just go and experience it, and then see the suffering for yourself. We can't imagine what it is like today. We will never be able to get to the West Bank for years, but we can see the genocide now spreading into the West Bank. And I'm really worried where this is going. So see it for yourself. Meet with Israeli Jews of all levels. Go to a settlement. If you can, meet with some of these militant Kahana types, but they probably won't meet with you. And then meet with some of the few Israeli peaceniks who are resisting, leaving the military. But mainly spend time in Palestinian villages, areas, Bethlehem, Ramallah, all over, and see for yourself. Again, it might be a little risky, but the Palestinians, I've found, will always take care of you. So that's number one. Center
Right.
Palestine, center Palestinian voices. Begin to read their theology, bring them here, and then study. Go deep into this biblically, theologically. And you mentioned Gary Burge, Stephen Sizer, and many others who are working on this. There's a wonderful website, www.christianzionism.org. That will give you a lot of tools and help you go deeper, particularly as an evangelical. This is a website run by evangelicals for evangelicals to provide an alternative. It's also in Spanish. Then I think we need to get active. We need to be challenging our senators and Congress people. And it might be good, if you can, to do it with Jews and Muslims so that they're listening to the whole community. I know here in Chicago, my wife and I are in a suburb, and our congressional district has the largest number of Palestinians in the whole United States. And our congressmen and our two senators are pretty insensitive to that fact. They don't represent us. So we need to get churches standing together and going to visit these congressional offices and increase our numbers, our phone calls, our protests. We should be raising hell about this regional war now spreading into Lebanon and why the U.S. is supplying weapons. We need to stop the weaponization. In fact, I think we need to go beyond just calling for a ceasefire. We need to call for a permanent cessation of the violence on all sides, coupled with an end to the weaponization of Israel. That's the only way we'll stop this. And then for massive amounts of humanitarian aid to rescue and save the Palestinians who are dying in Gaza. So, we have to, Jesus was very political in terms of challenging the empire and challenging the Jewish establishment. We can't have this dualistic thing where you can't be political. Aristotle defined politics as the art of making and keeping human life human. That is very theological. That was Jesus' ministry. That's Matthew 25. Where were you when I was thirsty? Did you bring me drink? So if Israel's denying water, we should be raising that issue as a value that we as Christians believe. When I was in prison, did you visit me? How many Palestinian prisoners are there? Do we think of these prisoners as hostages that are being sodomized and brutalized in prisons? That has to stop. Where were you when that was happening? So we have to be engaged. It's a value. It's a Christian value to end this oppression, to end these wars, and then to be on the side of what's healing. This is the only way Israel will ever be secure. And more importantly, Jews will need to be part of a whole new democratic solution. So I guess I would just call for advocacy and eventually to do it intersectionally. But you may have to first educate your church. My wife and I have been organizing Gaza presentations, and Ben Norquist has been helping us with a few that we've done. And we always try to do it with Jewish, Muslim, and a Christian perspective. And we've been bringing Muslim doctors in who have served in Gaza, who tell what they saw, what the experience really is. We bring a Jewish voice from Jewish Voice for Peace, and then a Christian perspective into the church. And that, I think, really helps. And it educates in multiple ways. And then we try to show what you should be doing. This is an urgent moment that we are in. I think it's no exaggeration to say it's like Germany in a way, in 1932, 1933, where the National Socialist Party takes over. And then one of the first things they did was they silenced the churches. They were forced to sign the Aryan Clause, that they will support this racist government and strategy. Now, we're not nowhere near that, but we're being silenced in other ways. We're being pushed by the whole idea to criticize Israel or even call for a ceasefire as anti-Semitic. Give me a break. That is a misuse, and our Jewish friends in Jewish Voice for Peace will help us with that. So we need to transcend that and go back to our values, and our voices need to be raised. So this is a very serious time we are in, and it's a more urgent moment than most of us realize. And for me, I believe saving the Palestinian case. The Palestinians are a test case for the global world order. The world order that came out of World War II, the international courts, the Fourth Geneva Conventions, all that was a response that never again should there be a genocide. If this goes by, if Israel gets away with this genocide, and even if the U.S. gets away with funding it, then genocide is normalized and authoritarianism rises. That's why I believe this is an urgent moment for us to take action, for us to get educated and get our churches mobilized. So many churches have been silent. And Munther Isaac came to challenge the churches, not just on ceasefire, but stopping the weapons and being on the side of justice, which will be the best for all of us.
Right. Yeah, I hope the audience would pause and rewind 15 minutes, get a piece of paper and a pencil and a pen, and just write down all these examples we gave. I think there's a lot of helpful, practical examples of how people can do, how can they respond to what's happening. And it could be the simple stuff of talking to their pastor all the way to pushing for BDS or other kind of action.
Right. I'd even add one more.
Yes, yeah.
Prayer. Since I've been retired, I'm not rushing around quite as much, so I try to start every morning with a time of Bible reading, meditation, reflection, and prayer. And prayer centers me, meditation centers me, so that I can be a little bit more sensitive to some of these needs and listen to God's leading. But prayer is multidimensional. It also raises me to be more conscious of these other needs, and then to be able to take action within my limitations that are more consistent with what a follower of Jesus should be doing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm glad you mentioned prayer. I think for many people, prayer has become like an excuse to inaction. I'm just going to pray for peace.
It's just the opposite.
Exactly. It's like it's the first step you take so that you hear the Spirit, what the Spirit is telling you to do. And I think that's hugely important. Before we wrap up, I just want to I want to bring up this issue because you mentioned stop weaponizing Israel, because the defenders of Israel would say, well, we have to weaponize Israel because Israel has to defend itself. And if we have a ceasefire, then that would embolden other forces against Israel. But you're saying, no, stopping the weaponization of Israel is actually necessary for Jewish safety as well as Palestinian safety. How do you unpack that? Like, how is it a good thing for the Jewish people and for Israel to not rely on weapons and not to get weapons from the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're talking about the fourth leading nuclear power in the world, the strongest army in the Middle East. And they have used weaponization and war consistently from their founding. Israel was founded in violence and weaponization when they drove out half the Palestinian population in 1948 and 49. So from its inception, Israel has been militant and aggression, and it's never been secure.
Right.
And there has to be, you can never find peace until you make peace with your enemy. This is essential. Israel will still be a very strong nation, but they're going to be in constant cycles of violence. And now they're alienating Hezbollah, which is no small thing. They've got Syrian and Iraqi pro-Iranian militants. Weapons are being, or drones are being fired at them, and missiles from the Houthis in Yemen. So the more weaponization Israel is doing in the region, and for Netanyahu, he is on a war path to keep himself out of prison, because as soon as his government collapses, he's going to go on trial for corruption. So as long as he's in office, as long as he keeps the war going, he's going to stay in office and be free of litigation. If that is at the bottom, I mean, that is an immoral, unjust rationale. So let's think about that and challenge that. Let's think about the history of Israel's aggression in the region and find another path, if it can find a way to reconcile first with the Palestinians and then with the neighbors. Perhaps Israel could find another way forward. And I think this also gets at realism. I mean, they'll still have their weapons, they'll still have their army, but they can never be safe and secure as long as that is the only thing they depend on for security. Security has to be based in justice and in right relationships.
Right. Yep. That's fantastic. Yeah. and yeah, I think also just to add to that, to what he just said, it's, like, the more you inflict violence on people are going to respond in violence, right? Hezbollah wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Israeli invasion to Lebanon in the 80s, in the early 80s.
That's
and
right.
So on. So it's like, is this like, haven't we learned from the past? Like, don't we understand how violence is created and these groups come to the surface? Just because I want to wrap up here, but because I listened to a talk you gave, and you and I mentioned this already, so I want to make sure that we include it here, which is that you want to designate Christian Zionism as heresy, which is I don't know, maybe controversial.
It's a strong, and I've come to this.
How do you work that out? Like, how do you make, what does that mean?
If you look at the definition of a heresy, we've had many in church history, if you study them. A heresy is a half-truth, a partial truth that kind of empties the whole truth of its power and its full meaning. So Christian Zionism, takes certain approaches, so it weaponizes the Bible. It creates kind of a solidarity with Israel at the expense of Palestinians and at the expense of many values. It really jumps over Jesus. It misses Matthew 25. And in fact, if you look at the dispensational scenario, Christians are raptured out of the world and escape all the conflagration that will happen, rather than being in the world working for peace and justice as God's emissaries. So the born-again Christians escape that. And then Jesus comes back as a warrior Messiah, which is the opposite of what he was and the positions he took. So Christian Zionism creates a different narrative by cherry-picking the Bible, but it empties the real essence of God's message of love neighbor, and love God as yourself, and the call to solidarity and lifting up the poor to be instruments of healing and reconciliation in the world and justice. So that's why I would call it a heresy.
Yeah, makes sense. It distorts Jesus, but also distorts the image of God in humanity, in people.
Yeah, who is God in this? I mean, does God side with one ethno-national group?
Yeah. God is a racist?
Is God a real estate dealer? No.
Okay, this is wonderful. Don, thank you so much for this. Please stick around. I just want to ask you one quick question afterwards for our Patreon supporters. But yeah, your wisdom, your passion, the centrality of Christ and prayer in your life, in your activism, I think is very inspiring. So very grateful for you for being here and for sharing your wisdom with us. And I think the audience are going to really appreciate what you're doing. So thank you, Don.
Thank you for the opportunity, Dan.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.